Why would so many different peoples, Creoles to Croatians, Cajuns to Chinese, settle in these forbidding wetlands?
You could always find things to eat, with the shrimps and the crabs and the oysters.
What did they have to overcome before they could recognize and profit from nature's elusive bounty?
As a young person, I started off with the small ones. They wouldn't trust me with the bigger ones, the bigger animals.
How did fighting one disaster cause another?
I know now that it was wrong, but at the time I thought we were doing something great.
Travel to the bayous of southeast Louisiana and let their peoples take you back in time to see how history and ecology are forever changing one another. The following production was funded by the Barataria-Terrebonne National Estuary Program, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, the Louisiana Department of Environmental Quality, the Louisiana Endowment for the Humanities, the Louisiana Nature and Science Center, and Louisiana Public Broadcasting.
If you go down the bayou, they still tell the story of a little girl named Mattoon whose family was so poor, her only toy was an old cooking spoon. One day, Mattoon went out to play. She sat by the edge of the water and began to dig in the sand. And she dug, and she dug. That little ditch got bigger and wider. Then the water started coming in, scarring it out. Mattoon would grow up and use that spoon for cooking. But year after year, the tides would work that ditch she dug, making it bigger still and wider still. This is the place bayou people still call Croc-a-Mattoon, named after the little girl who started it with the only toy she had. The things we do can have enormous, unexpected consequences. This is a story of people and the environment. On the Gulf Coast of Louisiana, wedged between two branches of America's mightiest river, lies Barataria-Terrebonne, a region where the boundaries of land and water are not fixed. Transitions that elsewhere take thousands of years happen here in a single human generation.
Well, that camp was land, and it was all the way down. That was all land, and then I used to go there, and there was just a little bay here.
And how much land did you have around it?
Around here? I say I got close to 1,000 acres right in this area.
Because the Mississippi drains 32 states and 2 Canadian provinces, on any given day carries tons of sediment. These sediments are basically parts of Kansas, Nebraska, Illinois, and all of this material, these sediments, are being pushed towards South Louisiana. So the sediments begin to fall out. They create a delta. One delta forms another delta that forms another delta. And what we do is we get a whole series of stacking deltas through time.
Barataria-Terrebonne was built by shifting Mississippi River deltas. In these new mud flats of the Atchafalaya, the land building process continues still. Europeans and Africans, Native Americans, and Asians each adapted to fit this landscape, but perhaps none more successfully than an infamous criminal who would become a famous hero. His name was Jean Lafitte, and his genius lay in using Barataria-Terrebonne's bayous to avoid paying taxes.
Why would people be in those barrier islands? You can fish, you can farm. If you wanted money, smuggling is not a bad activity. And you will see it happen throughout the history of the area. There was a Spanish fort built at the entrance of Barataria in the mid-18th century. It's for customs, trying to control. It never apparently was very effective. In the same way that the Coast Guard would patrol in the rum runners' age, when they were smuggling Chinese and Filipinos, illegal immigrants in the 19th century.
In 1718, the French founded New Orleans to claim the Mississippi Valley. Across the river in Barataria-Terrebonne, two very different groups of French immigrants had one thing in common. Both had been thrown out of somewhere else. The Cajuns had settled far to the north in eastern Canada until conquering British sent them into exile. Resettling in Barataria-Terrebonne, Cajuns thrived and absorbed many other immigrants.
You got Spanish, German, Italians, American, French. So it's, I don't know what the percentage of blood heritage is as far as the real Cajuns are.
Meanwhile, on the island of Haiti, French sugar plantations prospered until their slaves revolted.
The Acadians left France, leaving behind the feudalistic trappings of the society that they had known. The island people, on the other hand, hoped to recreate in the islands a romanticized vision of that feudalistic society with themselves on top as the aristocracy. They had done that with great success in the islands until they were thrown out.
Creoles are associated with grand plantations. Together with the Cajuns, they would keep French a living language in Barataria-Terrebonne into the 21st century. But that didn't stop France from selling Louisiana to the United States in 1803, or keep England a decade later from trying to take it away. As portrayed in Cecil B. DeMille's epic, the Creole Jean Lafitte saved the day.
You're a mite late, Mr. Lafitte.
Oh, we're not accustomed to traveling by land.
To hold the bazaars where he sold his contraband, Jean Lafitte chose the highest spot around, a mound built from the shells of clams gathered by long-ago Indians.
The Indians ate them, and they ate a lot of them. They used their shells to make Indian mounds. This is a prehistoric Indian mound. The mound was built sometime between around 600 AD and 900 AD. And later on, Europeans came into this area and put their house on top of it.
As we adapt to our environment, we also change that environment. Engineers built a fort on the site of Lafitte's old headquarters by mining Indian mounds for mortar and fill. In Barataria-Terrebonne, Europeans discovered a land that would seem as oddly different to us after 3 centuries of altering it as it did to the 18th century visitor who wrote, "Every day we sighted buffaloes and deer, wolves and wild turkeys, bears and cougars." Oh, what tales to tell. German colonists came to Barataria-Terrebonne following a most human impulse, to get rich quick.
Right away they saw that this was not what they had been promised. First of all, there were no mountains here as they had been promised. There was no gold, silver, lead mines. This was jungle to them. This was another world, and they wanted to leave. They petitioned to leave, to go back to Germany. As horrible as it was there with the famine and wars, they asked to go back. But the Indians, of course, knew what would grow here. And they showed the Europeans quite a bit of what they could eat and what they couldn't and what to grow.
West African immigrants from Senegambia had no illusions about getting rich. They came as slaves.
Those who were captured in warfare were sold. To a great extent, they were sold to the Atlantic slave trade. The Senegambian region was the heartland of the great medieval empires. They were mainly Islamic empires, in fact. Highly literate, very productive. The first 2 slave trade ships, which brought slaves to Louisiana, were instructed to bring slaves who knew how to cultivate rice and seed
The Germans from the Rhine River, the Africans from the Senegal River, and the Native Americans from the Mississippi, who those three groups got together and made the agriculture work.
In their natural state, Barataria-Terrebonne's rivers and bayous overflowed their banks each spring, dropping sediment, building land. Most silt fell close to the bank, forming a natural levee, precious elevation in such flat, watery terrain. Cajun cowboys used the natural levees or front lands as trails for driving longhorn cattle.
Estates were located along rivers and major bayous, and then back from the rivers and bayous were swamps.
Best place for placing a house was on the natural levee, which was close to the bank of the river. And the back lot was used for lumbering, for cypress, and for hunting in the swamps.
Barataria-Terrebonne's front lands would eventually produce everything from soybeans to citrus. But ever since Haitian Creoles shared the secrets of this process, crystallizing cane juice into sugar, it was sugar cane that dominated local agriculture. This woman's English colonial ancestors had grown tobacco in Virginia, then cotton in Mississippi, before moving to Bayou Terrebonne to join the sugar boom.
We had 10,000 acres in sugar. That's down from Big Bar Black, all the way up here, all the way that way.
You see, you top it first, and then after that you bottom it, and you throw it across the road. Till you get a pile, and you get a little further, you make another pile.
And one of the horrible things about the sugar cane, you had to have the machete to cut the cane, and that was all day during the harvesting season, all day, all weekend, and indeed just the process of cutting it and being stooped over, trying to get out of the way of the fellow laborers' machete was a very difficult and dangerous lifestyle.
You didn't have no age to work like they got now. If you was big enough to go out there and cut a can, you could work. If you was big enough to go on the road behind the wagon and pick the can up and throw it on the side of the road, you could work. Well, it changed, you know. One thing, they used to do it by the wagons, mules. And then after that, when them tractors started coming in, well, they used tractors. They didn't use no more mules.
Whether to buy slaves in the 1820s or tractors in the 1920s, to finance developing their front lands, planters often turned to their swampy backlands. Native Americans had taught bayou settlers about cypress, a swamp wood that was easily worked and resisted rot.
The frame of the house was built from squared timbers. The exterior was planked with clapboards, and the roof of the house was planked with cypress shingles such as this, which were all made by hand out of sections of trunks of the cypress tree. Then the entire frame of the house was lifted on large cypress blocks 2 to 3 feet tall so that the house would be elevated above the damp soil.
Some of the sawmill owners were accused of encouraging slaves to run away so that they could benefit from their labor, and their masters did not benefit from their labor because they were gone, right? But the sawmill owners paid the maroons, the escaped slaves, by the piece for each squared cypress log they delivered, so that a whole culture of runaway slaves developed in the swamps beyond the plantation area.
In 1803, the area's first steam sawmill was wrecked by sawyers afraid it would put them out of work, but other mills would soon follow. By the mid-19th century, cypress lumbering had grown from plantation sideline into an industry in its own right.
Those big cypress, a lot of times they'd stand up in pirogues, and one on each side, a pirogue on the other side of the tree, one on this side, with the crosscut saw and saw away on which there was some big trees back then.
The cypress stumps, they've got some here that the bottom part of the trunk that still remains in the swamp today. Some of those things are about 8 feet in diameter. You could almost have a dance on what's left.
Systematically, tree by thousand-year-old tree, loggers clear-cut the swamps till not a single large stand of virgin cypress remained.
Now, this is cypress, the second generation from the old virgin cypress that was originally here when the first settlers arrived, and which I guess was fine logging was completed on the old growth cypress somewhere in the late 20s. And I think most of the cutting systems back then were take everything that's merchantable, and if you have to tear up that's left, don't worry about it, get it. Certainly not that way today.
Timber towns became ghost towns. Locals returned to seasonal lifestyles, fishing in autumn, trapping in winter, crawfishing in spring, in summer frogging, crabbing, turtling.
They got deer, squirrels, rabbits. That's what we lived off back then. We lived off the game, we lived off of the land. Like the good Bible said, good book said, live off of the land. And that's what we done. And I can still do it. I could do it right now, it wouldn't bother me a bit.
Fishermen to me are like the pioneers, like that first came to America, you know, they went out west and stuff. You know, they stood all the hardships, you know, but they did it for themselves, you know, they wasn't afraid. And fishermen's the same way, you know, you come out here, you live off the land. If it's good, you do good. If it's bad, you do bad. You know, most kids, when they first job, they go work in a store or something. Well, over here, first thing you do, you come crawfishing with your daddy, you know. I take my little boy now, he's only 4, but I've been taking him since he was 2, you know. I mean, I don't take him all the time because he's pretty small, but I take him.
The spring floods that filled the back swamps and floated the logs, the same spring floods that replenished the fertile front lands, were also the biggest problem faced by the sugar planter.
If you live in places like South Louisiana, you will flood. It might be every 5 years, it might be every 100 years, depending on how well you build your house and how much luck. The way our grandfathers and forefathers thought about it, they learned once they flooded once, they didn't flood as bad the next time because they did something about it.
To prevent floods, it seemed logical to augment natural levees with man-made ones. Eventually, the Mississippi and major bayous were lined with levees.
But what the levees also did was constrict flow and force all of the floodwaters into this straitjacket. And if there was any break in that system, we had a massive amount of water that flowed out. We would call it a crevasse. And that crevasse contributed to regional flooding, often on a major scale.
In 1903, a crevasse ruined much of the sugar crop. The response was to dam Bayou Lafourche, an outlet of the Mississippi from its source. Along with the levees, such changes stopped the Mississippi sediment from reaching the backlands and coastal marshes.
One of the major changes that you have from the first inhabitants to right now is that you had some high land that, and some areas now you don't have any. Almost 10 miles from the coastline, except for the beachfronts, you have very little high land. No ridges like this, where maybe 100 years ago you had ridges like this almost all the way to the Gulf.
Directly behind me, over to the left, this whole area that's now Salt Marsh was all the actual sugarcane fields where they produced in the 1840s 300,000 pounds of sugar. Between us and the Gulf, this is the ruins of the old sugar mill. It's a 4-stall plantation built in about the 1820s, and it ran all the way through the Civil War. The wetlands were still a dynamic situation where there wasn't a real problem with erosion back then. There was certain areas that were eroding, but with the natural crevasses, there was always an influx of nutrients and fresh water at the time.
Though levees relieved flooding, they stopped Barataria-Terrebonne's natural replenishment. Then came 1927.
1927, the levee had broke. Everything was flooded. All this was flooded. All this was under the water. Right? This is water completely around. All you see right here was all water back in there. Plaquemine, all up in that Grove State, and all them areas have been poured out, and everywhere was all flooded.
Along the lower Mississippi, flooding drove 2/3 of a million people out of their homes and into refugee camps. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers went to work, digging, building, dredging, creating spillways to keep this from happening again.
People in the past were well aware of floods, so it was logical, if you were going to flood, build your house elevated. So all of the older homes are elevated on pillars. The reason for that, in case of flood, the water went under your house. Levees were built, maybe a false sense of security. Now we put our homes flat on the ground.
People talk about, boy, I got this house, a nice piece of land. It's high and dry, but I got these nice cypress trees growing there. Well, wait a minute. I mean, cypress trees grow in wet soils. So right off the bat, the idea of high and dry doesn't exist in this area. You know, it's artificial.
Now what we have to deal with flooding, not so much from the Mississippi directly, but from record rainfall. We have managed the hydrology to such a point that we have a whole series of little basins in between these levee systems, and if the pumps aren't working at full capacity, we often flood.
Along the bayous, the landscape had been forever changed, but on sugarcane farms, the routine of work remains constant. These sugarcane fields share the environmental issues of American agriculture and mirror the problems of living in an industrial society. Fertilizers replenish the soil, pesticides fight crop diseases, but runoff can pollute waterways. And while farmers must weigh costs and benefits, homeowners often spare no expense for a green lawn. And for every local toxic source, the Mississippi River carries the chemical debris of 1/3 of America. Human activities drastically altered the bayou front lands, but what would happen when people moved into even more fragile corners of Barataria-Terrebonne? Oh, what tales to tell. You might think this Cajun moss picker distant from the bustle of 20th century commerce. You'd be wrong. The moss he picks might wind up stuffing Park Avenue sofas or the seats of Henry Ford's Model Ts.
There wasn't no fellow with a necktie and white collar in the office. It's people that knew the swamp area and trapped and fished for a living, those type of people that does that.
We used to pick moss a lot. We'd pick green moss and bed it, and when it cured, we'd sell it.
It was just a long pole with a hook on the end of it to reach those higher places, you know. And then if you had a partner, they'd pick the lowest moss, you know, what they could, and the other one would get up in the derrick and get the high stuff up high up in the tree.
They had several moss gin years back, you know. But as far as I know, as of now, I'm the only one in the whole world.
Fashion, politics, and changing technology constantly alter the global marketplace. As people in even the most out-of-the-way spots respond to that marketplace, they in turn alter the ecosystems where they live.
If you're going down from New Orleans, for example, you pass through swamp. You enter a marshland, and certainly in the 18th and 19th century, there is a transition. Life is air is. The whole temperament is different. It is a land filled with prairie tremblant, shaking earth. You don't know if the very ground that you're walking on, or the weeds that are batted down, are going to be there tomorrow.
In the Barataria-Terrebonne estuary lies thousands of square miles of marsh, hostile to agriculture but abundant with life. Here, Spain resettled Canary Islanders along strategic bayous like Barataria.
Here they come from mountainous country, dry, and they come into these swamps. Mosquitoes, by the jillions, you could get them by the handsful. Well, they started naming every lake, every pond, for what they left in the Canary Islands. That's how homesick they were.
200 years later, they still call themselves Isleños, islanders, and still sing the Spanish decimas that tell of their people's travails.
Pescando en el mes de febrero.
The Houma Indians is considered one of the few native tribes of Louisiana. We originally lived where the Red River and the Mississippi meet. Early 1700s, after we had met the French, learned the French language, we decided to start moving further south. In fact, Baton Rouge got its name from the red pole of the Houmas.
The Indian is what really taught the Cajuns the methods of decoy. They used to make their decoys with cane reeds and feathers.
I don't think anybody can claim that there isn't a way that you cannot make a living here. Everywhere you turn, there's food. I mean, there's a bounty of seafood. The earth is rich. Anywhere you cut it, in this part of the world, if you go hungry, it's only because you're on a diet.
And I've seen enough pool doos on the water to where it would actually cover the water. You couldn't see no water at all. That's how plentiful they were.
They would go out to the marshes and they would shoot the ducks, mostly French and pintails, mallards and pintails, for the market.
By 1900, local market hunters shipped 250,000 ducks a year to restaurants around the country.
I can remember going with my father one time where we killed, I don't know the exact number, but it was quite a bit, to where we had to walk the pirogue back to the car. We couldn't ride the pirogue because it had too many of them in there. But it's, things like that will never happen again, I don't believe. I know now that it was wrong, but at the time I thought we were doing something great.
Living resources are not infinite, and the things we do can have unexpected consequences, sometimes quite unexpected.
When the Civil War came along, of course, necessity being the mother of invention, we had military boots being made out of alligator. Consequently, we may have had the most elegantly shod army in all of history marching across the South in these alligator boots. By the end of the 19th century, an enormous number of hides had been taken to produce everything from trunks, huge amounts of luggage, through a variety of footgear and other products. All of this hunting really lowered the local population, and of course it took the larger animals out.
With fewer gators to eat them, muskrat populations soared. With more muskrats around, the grasses they eat began to disappear.
An eat-out is when any species becomes too populated in an area and simply eats all of the food. And they not only eat all of the standing vegetation, but they also consume the roots and leave nothing but bare soil or open water.
To stop muskrat eat-outs, trapping was promoted. Cheap Louisiana muskrat pelts spurred the rage for fur coats that symbolized the Roaring Twenties. Thousands of miles of ditches called trenasses access trapping grounds.
When fur in the early 1900s became the thing, people were buying them up, and I mean, you just could not catch enough.
every trapper, you could expect them to catch anywhere from 4,000 to 12,000 muskrats in a 3-month season. And some years they were worth a lot of money. Some years they were worth $1.50, even $2. So this made them not want to fish crabs for sure, 25 cents a basket.
Well, I would actually skin the muskrats. And as a young person, I started off with the small ones. They wouldn't trust me with the bigger ones, the bigger animals, so I started with the little muskrats and learned how to do it on them because they wasn't worth as much money. The furs wasn't.
It was common for us to be gone 3 months out of the year. My mother had a record of being able to skin 59 muskrats in 1 hour. 59 muskrats in 1 hour. That's skinning them. And that is something to see.
We take a boatload of sweet potatoes out, crackers and little whiskey, you know, and things like that. Take it out. And then we'd buy the fuzz and sell them some sweet potatoes and so forth. So we used to come back with a boatload of fuzz.
Incidentally, I probably had more pets, weird pets, than a lot of children or young people have ever had. I had muskrats, I had rabbits, I had otter. The only pet that I remember not liking, it wasn't my favorite, it's because my daddy brought some baby alligators home, or a baby alligator, and I kissed it and it hung on my lip and wouldn't turn loose, so I didn't like that one.
Oh, those gators. They'll crawl back into the story. But meanwhile, no more eat-outs. The marsh was saved, and people were making money, too. But a good thing can always be improved upon. In the 1930s, a Tabasco sauce millionaire introduced a larger fur-bearing rodent, the nutria, from South America.
With the nutrients over there, you don't have no more muskrats at all. And they just start on the marsh and you don't see nothing. Even the ducks and all don't come around.
The problem comes when they get to be too many nutria. When there were just a handful of nutria out there, it wasn't a real problem. With the decline in the fur industry, trapping has just declined sharply in our state, so there's really no control out there. So they're literally starting to stand on top of one another as they continue to breed with no control.
The things we do can have enormous, unexpected consequences, such as more eat-outs. Land like this had traditionally been viewed as wasteland, an unhealthy, watery desert.
They might better drain the swamps and clean up the city.
Is that what they do in Yankee land?
They do, and a lot of other customs up north that'll bear copying.
Around 1900, after the closing of the American frontier, speculators paying pennies an acre bought huge chunks of Barataria-Terrebonne marshland to drain for farming.
I worked all over in here, everywhere. I used to drive a tractor. When I was 12 years old, I was driving a tractor. And we used to haul sugar cane. In this area right here, there was a lot of sugar cane. We had some. This was mostly, when I was growing up, was sugar cane and more cotton and more potatoes. Irish potatoes were grown mostly.
The very name given to developing these marshes, reclamation, implied that humans were restoring them to their rightful place in the world. Mother Nature didn't always think so.
The first time it flooded, they pumped it out again. And a few years later, it flooded, and this time they just let it go. You know, they said they weren't going to fix it back. So everybody had to move out. I could go point out where my grandmother lived, my uncles, my aunts. I had several relatives here. I can go point, drive a stick where they lived. I can see it right now, just like the day it was when I was here.
But even successful land reclamation reduces habitat for other species, such as these birds John James Audubon saw during his travels through Barataria-Terrebonne. These marshes are nursery to waterfowl, fish, and more than a third of America's shrimp catch. But through most of the 20th century, their value would be measured by what lay thousands of feet under them.
It was clear that coastal Louisiana should be a major oil province. The oil industry got involved, but they had difficulty in exploiting for the product. All of their technology was land-based, so they tried to transfer land-based technology in a wetland environment. It didn't work. So they had to go back and rethink how they would drill for oil.
This machine conquered Barataria-Terrebonne's trembling prairies, but its tracks scarred the marsh. Canals were dredged for heavy drilling rigs, and more canals, pathways for toxins that degraded water quality. Then came wider, deeper ship channels, letting in salt water that killed cypress forest. In 1958, Hollywood portrayed the clash between Cajun fishermen and oilmen drilling the first offshore well.
All right, now you may put me out of business, all of you. But that isn't important. The important thing is that there's oil under this Gulf. And we need it. Everybody needs it. You need it. Without oil, this country of ours would stop. And it'd start to die. And you'd die.
They had a positive effect. They certainly opened the area up. They increased the income base. They, in many ways, contributed to the infrastructure. There are, of course, some negatives. One could argue that maybe the culture didn't need to be diluted. One could also look at the extensive networks of canals built by the oil companies. And one looks at those canals and say, well, they destroyed the landscape. But nobody cared about the landscape.
Attitudes change. In the last half-century, we've learned how precious and fragile Barataria-Terrebonne's marshes are.
The fishing camps that you'll see behind me are used as permanent residence for some people and as weekend getaways for others, and people come and fish and enjoy themselves. There's also commercial fishing activity out here, oyster beds, shrimping operations, and a variety of activities that people come down here and they enjoy the solitude of the marsh and enjoy being able to catch fish at their front door and cook them for dinner that night.
The thing that has made Louisiana work economically, culturally, and biologically has been the vast expanses of marshes that we have. You know, we've got the most expansive marshes basically in the New World. So if anything destroys those marshes, it has a huge economic impact, because when the standing vegetation goes, then there's no more organic material to wash tidally out into the estuaries into the Gulf of Mexico. And since there's no organic material washing out there, there's nothing for the bottom of the food chain to feed on. And so then they die, and then the things that eat them die, and pogie die as an example. And if pogie die, then you don't have any more fish meal. And if you don't have fish meal, then you can't run catfish farms in Mississippi, or you can't raise chickens in northern Louisiana and Arkansas.
Oh, what tales to tell. And this one isn't finished. Remember those gators?
Alligators, to us, is a crop. We start off with, instead of a seed, an egg that we harvest in the wild from the wild alligator nests. Only a small percentage of them are really aggressive, but it doesn't take many to leave a lasting impression. We've literally been chased out of the airboat, given them the airboat and said, "Here's yours, I'm walking home."
Watch that alligator now, Larry. Daughter.
One of the important things to realize about this farming, we're helping the wild population in a couple of different ways. One way is that we're releasing back to the wild more alligators than would have survived naturally. Another strange thing that happens, all of a sudden when the landowner can get $40,000, $50,000 of extra money for eggs on their property, they're really reluctant to take that property and drain it for crop farming or anything else. They want to keep it in its natural state.
Maybe in alligator farming lies the seed, or perhaps egg of an idea. People even in the most out-of-the-way spots respond to the marketplace. Careful stewardship of wetlands lies in figuring out practical ways to harvest their resources without destroying those fragile lands in the process. Escaping near slavery on Spanish ships, Filipinos began arriving in Barataria-Terrebonne as early as 1765.
They have the subtropical climate, they have the fish, they have the shrimp, practically everything that they need to exist are available in Louisiana. One thing that they were very familiar with the typhoon, just like the hurricane that they have here. Just like the villages in the Philippines, they raised their houses like from 10 to 12 feet above the water.
Across the world in Croatia lived another seafaring people.
When Napoleon came, it decimated the fleet and created a surplus of sailors, which in turn created a high unemployment. So when these people came to New Orleans, they had the fishing skills and the boat handling skills.
They were from down on the coast, the Croatian coast. They were all fishermen, but they came into New Orleans and all, they come down here to fish. I think the Yugoslavs invented the oyster business here.
But if oysters were familiar, much was different. The Croatians had left high mountains and deep bays for this. So they adopted Filipino house styles.
The camps were on the stilts with the wharf in front, and oyster lugger or two or three, several skiffs. And to build a beach, they merely threw the dead oyster shells there and made their own beaches.
We used to sail out to the reef, park on top of the reef, rake the oysters with the rakes. They'd sell them off the boats right in at the docks in New Orleans. That's why you got only oysters in winter months till today, because it used to take them 3 or 4 days to get to the market. And if it was warm, they'd die in too. So you had cold weather, you could keep them for a week.
Cajuns and others copied Croatians, but winter oystering did not provide a year-round livelihood. But in summer, shrimp swarmed these bays.
This has become an outstanding, well-known area for the best dried shrimp in the world, that people hanker for it throughout the coastal areas of China. This was quite a staple of their diet, the dried shrimp and the dried fish.
We shipped a lot. In those days, we were broke, and China had money, and we were handling a Chinese product. So it just, developed and brought some money back into the territory, and it put a lot of people to work.
In the Barataria-Terrebonne estuary, exporting shrimp, fish, and even live terrapins to China became big business.
This is a shrimp drying platform. This one's on Fifi Island behind Grand Isle. It's one of about 6 in Barataria Bay and about 15 of them they had along the coast. They were established in the 1870s by the Chinese immigrants, Filipinos, and also a lot of French people worked out here.
You jump in the water, holding one end of the seine, your back would be covered with mosquitoes. You duck your head on and knock the mosquitoes off. The captain would direct the boat. He would circle the area. He'd go downwind maybe and circle back up here and come up this way and try to make it meet, trying to make the ends meet. But you had to pull, and it was hard work pulling. Sometimes you'd catch a tarpon or sharks. They would beat the side of the seine, going back and forth. Then everybody would holler, "Be careful, you get hit by the tail."
They'd take the shrimp and boil them Then they would spread them out on these large cypress platforms to dry in the sun, and they'd turn them with wooden rakes. And after they dried for a day or two, then they would put canvas on their shoes, and they would do a process they call dancing the shrimp, which is walking on the shrimp to separate the hulls from the dry shrimp themselves.
In the corner of their platform, there will be a Filipino who would be strumming their guitar and just playing music, and the whole family, the whole group would dance the shrimp.
Late 19th century Barataria Bay embodied the American melting pot. A gumbo of ethnic groups learned from each other to make sustainable use of wetlands resources. They lived on stilt villages, a Filipino legacy, built of cypress and palmetto, Native American building materials. They sailed the bays in luggers, a boat type from France. In summer, they dried shrimp by ancient Chinese techniques, and in winter, harvested oysters cultivated by Croatian methods.
They did not have mechanization, they did not have ice, so they lived as close to the resource site as they could. And therefore, throughout the basin, there were hundreds of these small communities, all surviving around the renewable resource base.
You produce a fairly unique people, a very insular people, a people who were 54 miles as the crow flies, if you want to get there from New Orleans by boat, or 54,000 if you want to communicate with them, which is one reporter said in 1896. So I think it still might be an apt quote.
Wetland resources drew immigrants from Ireland, Germany, Spain, Italy, as well as Cajuns and Creoles from the interior frontlands. On a seaside ridge, or cheniere, the 1880s fisheries rush made Caminadaville the largest town on the Louisiana coast. Across the pass at Grand Isle, another industry flourished: tourism. A frequent visitor was famous author Kate Chopin.
What drew Kate Chopin to Grand Isle is what really drew anybody with kids. And raising kids in New Orleans was tough. Well, it still is. But in those days, they had some of the same problems they do now. Crime in the streets. They also had disease, cholera, malaria. So she went to Grand Isle with her kids. It was just a beautiful place with tropical birds and flowers and a paradise, a perfect place.
By the 1890s, Grand Isle was the Gulf Coast's premier resort. Crances, a converted plantation, spruced up former slave cabins as tourist cottages and offered a casino. The Ocean Club was among America's ritziest hotels, with lodging for 1,000, a trolley that ran to beachside bathhouses, billiard rooms, and bowling alleys, even an observatory. It was completed in 1892. 1 year later, a hurricane thundered in. All the grand hotels were destroyed. Across the pass in Caminadaville, things were even worse.
During the morning, it was sort of overcast and drizzled. Nobody got excited about it because it was just normal for that time of the year.
My daddy, I remember him telling me, we thought the gnaw in French, on croit que c'était le gnaw. They thought it was the front coming in, which couldn't have been too bad, but it wasn't.
By that evening, the waves were breaking over the houses which were built along the beach along Caminada Bay over in this area. And people started evacuating and moved back into this area where there was another row of houses. And by midnight, the houses along the beach on this side were all devastated and gone.
I should remember what my father told, what time it was that it got calm. The wind just died out flat and even had mosquitoes. And they thought, well, what's going on here? Because they had never experienced an eye, being hit by the eye of a storm. All the kids were yelling, the women had prayed. He grabs one of his 1-year-old kids from his parents' arm or whoever was holding it, and he takes out in the yard, and water almost chest deep in the yard. And he walks over to an oak tree, which was a fair-sized oak. And he gets up on it with the baby, and he's sitting there holding on. No wind, all at once. Boy, he hears a rumble. It was just one wall of water, and the water, my daddy up in this tree got enveloped in water, and he said he lost his baby, the baby brother. He lost him, got washed out of his arms, and never saw it again to this day.
No one knows how many died. 1,000, perhaps 2,000. Most bodies were never found.
Many people left the oyster industry for good, came to New Orleans, and others went back to the old country, to Croatia, swore to never go back to the bayous and risk their lives.
But within a decade, the arrival of the gasoline engine made it practical to live safely inland, but still draw a living from the sea. Isolated marsh hamlets withered, but Grand Isle survived. The fancy resorts were gone, but people returned for the beaches and world-class sport fishing. The gasoline engine also spurred improvements like the oyster dredge and the shrimp trawl. Boats got bigger. When Japan invaded China in World War II, the dried shrimp market collapsed, but canneries, then refrigeration, fueled demand for Barataria-Terrebonne seafood. But ironically, the population growth such resources promote can endanger those very resources by polluting the water. Killer hurricanes returned in 1909, 1915, 1926. This is Grand Isle after Hurricane Betsy in 1965. But hurricanes not only destroy man-made structures, they also wash away the fragile land itself.
This coastline right here is the fastest eroding shoreline in North America. Beach erosion rates here in the long term are about 40 to 60 feet per year. Years with hurricanes, as we said, up to 120 feet to 150 feet. The beach will be where I am next year.
And barrier islands are just that, barriers. As they disappear, they expose to erosion even more fragile marshes behind them.
Sandy Point, Schofield Bay and all that, that's all gone. That's one big body of water now. All this here is gone. This here going west like that, that's all gone.
Computer models can now forecast coastline changes. Their predictions are terrifying. Barataria-Terrebonne loses an acre of wetlands, about the size of a football field, every 15 minutes.
These bays and bayous, that's your breeding ground for shrimps, oysters, fish, everything. Your natural, your coon, your muskrats and all that. When that marsh and all that's gone, everything's gone.
Some say Jean Lafitte still haunts these waters. Others claim it's the ghost of hurricane-drowned Croatians and Cajuns and Chinese. But what really haunts these waters is how we sacrifice this ecosystem's natural resiliency to fulfill the American dream. Its cypress swamps were clear-cut to fulfill the dream of home ownership. Its streams were channelized for the dream of making this country a global trading power. Its wetlands were drained and put to the plow for the dream of feeding not only America, but the world. Its marshes were crisscrossed with canals to fill the hungry gas tanks that came with the dream of 2 cars in every garage. There are no villains in this tale. Defining our relationship to these fragile lands is rarely easy and never permanent. We human beings have made ourselves stewards of the environment. Will we be skillful in that stewardship? It won't be easy. It'll take scientists and students, business and government, and mostly you and me. In Barataria-Terrebonne, there's many a tale yet to tell.
For more information on Barataria-Terrebonne and what you can do to help, call or write the Barataria-Terrebonne National Estuary Program, Post Office Box 2663, Thibodaux, Louisiana.